Welcome, everyone, as we approach the end of this part of the symposium. Here with us today is Dr. Riel Miller, joining us from a rooftop in Paris. We're glad to have you with us, Dr. Miller. Dr. Riel Miller is the head of Futures Literacy at UNESCO. And as we approach this part of the symposium, we have heard so far from a great many speakers. And one of the questions we may have in mind is how we can take all of this information that we have learned so far and apply it and put it to good use. And as we think about this, it seemed helpful to or rather, we're grateful to have with us somebody who can help orient us towards future action. So by means of introduction, Dr. Miller, why don't we start off just by sharing, would you please tell us what is futures literacy and what does that mean in the context of your work at UNESCO?
Thanks a lot. And I'm really pleased to be with all of you and to be able to share some of the ideas that we're working on, particularly because they have more salience in the context of a shock like the COVID-19 pandemic. Futures literacy, as it sounds, is a capability. In other words, it's the capacity that humans have to be able to, and I'll use a term that is not all that familiar, use the future. What does it mean to use the future? Well, we use the future all the time, actually. When you cross the street, you think about where the cars are and where they will be later on. Babies, when they cry, actually anticipate. They think that if they cry, they might get fed. And then through habit, they realize, oh yeah, I will get fed if I cry. So we have a very fundamental and basic relationship to the future, which is that we imagine it, and then it orients what we do, what we see. And that means that we can have this ability to use our imaginations and to understand the role of our imaginations, which is a capacity, a capability. So futures literacy is really understanding how our imaginations function, because the future can only be imaginary. The future, you can't go out and touch it. And also, it has this tremendous impact. What we imagine generates hope. What we imagine, I want an ice cream. What we imagine generates fear. I'm afraid of, let's say, the virus. And so it turns out that understanding better where our imagination comes from, how we can structure and use our imagination in different ways for different purposes, plays a big role in what we see and what we do, what we hope and what we fear, and generally is a really important aspect of understanding the world around us.
And how can this kind of literacy, the skill of being aware of the way in which we think about the future, how can this inform the current moment, this global pandemic that we're in?
Well, you know, it's on a number of different levels. There's a number of different points of entry. Obviously, one of the ways that the futures literacy is directly helpful is that the current situation has been rather brutal, violent in a way, about our images of the future. You thought you were going to be going to school physically. You thought you were going to be going to work physically. And so in your mind, you projected into the future doing that, right? And that was just normal, matter of fact. Then all of a sudden, through some sort of pretty strange process, you're locked down, you're confined, you're stuck to your house, you're not going where you used to go. And what do you begin to notice? You begin to notice all sorts of other things that you weren't paying attention to because they weren't important for the future that you expected. When our expected future, what we use all the time, is kind of torn away or made not accessible, we're obliged to begin to invent other futures. But because we don't have a lot of practice, because we're not, kind of futures literate, really, most people, this creates a kind of difficult situation, a discomfort, even fear. And so futures literacy in the current context, from the point of view of just finding ways for people to be more reassured, is important. Meaning to encourage people to realize you can imagine schooling which is what we're doing right now, you can't imagine schooling, learning happening another way. You just didn't have to. And so maybe we can imagine a future that isn't like the past. And you can begin to do things differently in the present. So that can be then reassuring. So I'm saying that, there's this two-sided aspect to futures literacy in a crisis. On the one hand, you're not as shocked by losing your image of the future because it's torn away from you. And on the other hand, you're better at thinking, hey, cool. Now that I've got a new idea of the future, I can do new things.
It seems that futures literacy encourages or enables us to think about different possible futures than the ones that we expect. I imagine one who is really strongly futures literate would imagine or see many possible futures, and the way we take action and move ourselves forward towards ones that we believe are hopeful really defines our ability to lead and act in moments like these. So the futures literacy is the foundational skill towards making strong decisions going forward. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah. I mean, you put your finger on a crucial and potentially somewhat confusing issue here. We're in a condition today, a situation where we have to really begin to embrace complexity. Not complexity as dial up, dial down, more complicated, less complicated, but actually that we live in a universe that's creative and that is full of novelty and that is continuously experimenting. I mean, what better evidence do we need than the COVID-19 virus?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, talk about an experiment, right? Talk about something that's novel. Talk about pandemics occurring in a context that never existed before. Sure, humans have had pandemics, but never in a context where we had airplanes flying all around the place and hospitals all over the place and tracking devices all over the place and the internet so that we could do stuff that we couldn't do before, etc. So what I'm saying is that to a certain extent, being futures literate is about being much more humble. And in that sense, it could be seen as a way of redefining leadership. It's not about being obsessed about the future, because the future changes all the time. It's in our imagination, and we can continuously invent it and reinvent it. What's crucial about the future is what it helps us see in the present. If we see all these options in the present, we can actually express our values. And so it allows us to show leadership by expressing our values in the present more creatively, more spontaneously, and more connected to what's really possible in the present.
So to put a pin on that and perhaps to wrap up, what advice or counsel would you give to our students in this moment in order to take advantage of or to begin a greater degree of futures literacy?
Look, this is not new to our societies or our cultures, and it's something that you can find in Aboriginal culture and storytelling. There's a shock of any kind, all sorts. You're shocked by something you see, shocked by a virus like this. All of a sudden, you see things in new ways. Pay attention to that. If you all of a sudden see that something doesn't work or something does work, the question is, why doesn't it work? How can it work? So let me take a really basic example. These days, a lot of us are connecting by video. The result is that I can be with you and that you would invite me, which really probably wouldn't have been imaginable before. But all of a sudden, the whole world's accessible. On the other hand, we're not present physically. When you're present physically, there's a sense of commitment, there's a sense of engagement, there's a sense of reciprocity and trust. And so we're accustomed to the protocols, the etiquette, the handshakes that make that meaningful, that create the environment of trust and exchanging and sharing. Today, we're only beginning to understand how we can take advantage of this amazing resource, which is the virtual connectivity, and make it as rich and powerful and genuine as we've experienced face to face when we're in the same room. So that's just one example of something that all of a sudden, because there's a change in the way we think about the future, we see the present and explore the potential of the present. And so that's my message. Keep an eye out for the potential of the present, things you didn't notice before because your image of the future, your idea of the future has changed, and what you are just doing isn't the same as what you were doing.
Mm. Dr. Riel Miller, Head of Futures Literacy at UNESCO, thank you so much for your time today. We're so grateful and hope to be in touch again in the future.
Real pleasure. Thanks a lot.